I worked 80-hour weeks bleeding myself dry to pay off my student loans while my parents smiled and praised the value of hard work. They told me my grandmother could only afford a small $500 graduation gift. I believed them. But then my grandmother walked into my tiny, freezing apartment and froze in her tracks. She looked at my worn-out shoes and my bare fridge and asked a question that shattered my entire reality. "Where is the $80,000 I sent you?" Her bank statement was about to turn a 4-year lie into a federal crime. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I am 26 years old. By day, I work as a medical billing specialist, sitting in a gray cubicle and fighting with insurance companies over denied claims. By night, I wipe down sticky tables and serve cherry pie at a 24-hour diner just outside the Chicago city limits. I work these double shifts because I have to. Because 4 years ago, when I graduated from state college, I was left with a mountain of debt and parents who told me that struggling was simply a necessary part of growing up. I believed them because I had always believed them. I was the good daughter, the quiet daughter, the one who never asked for too much and always accepted whatever crumbs of affection or support were thrown my way. Growing up, I learned very early that my family had a strict hierarchy. My older sister Emily was the golden child. She had my mother Susan's bright blonde hair and my father Richard's outgoing personality. My parents poured every ounce of their emotional and financial resources into Emily. They paid for her expensive out-of-state university tuition in full. They paid for her lavish country club wedding. They even provided the massive down payment for her beautiful 5-bedroom suburban house. When I asked for help with my community college tuition, my mother just sighed and shook her head. She told me they were completely tapped out. She told me I needed to figure it out myself, because building independence would make me a stronger person. I swallowed my hurt and did exactly what they asked. I took out student loans, I worked multiple part-time jobs, and I built my life entirely on my own. It was a bitter Tuesday afternoon in November when the illusion of my family finally broke. My grandmother, Clara, is 78 years old. She had recently suffered a mild stroke and spent months in a rehabilitation facility. I visited her every single chance I could get. I would sit by her bed reading to her, or just holding her fragile hand while she slept. My parents rarely visited. They always claimed they were too busy with their golf club social events or helping Emily decorate her massive new house. But Grandma Clara was a fighter. She recovered much faster than the doctors predicted, and the very first thing she wanted to do when she finally regained her mobility was to see my new apartment. I tried everything to talk her out of it. I told her the stairs were too steep for her legs. I told her the neighborhood was not entirely safe. The truth was, I felt deeply ashamed of how I was living. My apartment was a cramped, run-down studio, sitting directly above a noisy auto body shop. The heater barely worked, leaving the air constantly chilled. The linoleum floor in the kitchen was peeling up in brittle yellow curls. The only furniture I owned was a second-hand sofa I found on the sidewalk and a mattress lying directly on the floor because I could not afford a bed frame. I did not want the woman I loved most in the world to see me living like a stray dog. But Clara has always been incredibly stubborn. She took a taxi directly to my address. When I opened my flimsy wooden door and saw her standing in the hallway, leaning heavily on her cane, my heart sank. I stepped aside to let her in. Clara took 2 slow steps into the room and stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes scanned the bare walls, the cracked window taped up with cardboard to keep out the draft, and the single loaf of cheap bread sitting next to a jar of peanut butter on my tiny kitchen counter. That was my entire dinner for the week. She looked down at my feet, noticing the holes worn straight through the soles of my cheap work shoes. I expected her to give me a sympathetic smile. I expected her to tell me that things would eventually get better. Instead, the heavy leather purse slipped from her fingers and hit the peeling floor with a loud thud. Clara covered her mouth with her trembling hands and burst into tears. She did not just tear up, she sobbed. Deep, heavy sobs that shook her fragile shoulders. Panic immediately gripped my chest. I rushed forward and wrapped my arms around her. I thought the climb up the stairs had been too much for her recovering heart. I guided her to the old sofa and gently helped her sit down. I knelt on the floor in front of her, holding her cold hands in mine. I told her it was okay. I told her, please not to cry. I explained that I was doing perfectly fine. I said I was working hard and building character. That was the exact phrase my mother, Susan, and my father, Richard, had drilled into my head for my entire life. Hard work builds character. Struggle makes you strong. They told me that while they handed Emily the keys to a brand new luxury SUV. For me, they only had empty slogans about independence and grit. I told Clara all of this simply trying to comfort her and dry her tears. Clara pulled her hands away from mine. She framed my face with her palms. Her skin was soft, but her grip was incredibly strong. She looked dead into my eyes. Her tears suddenly stopped falling, replaced by a look of sheer, terrifying confusion. "Sarah," she said, her voice shaking violently. "Why are you living like this? Why are you working yourself into the ground?" I forced a light laugh and pointed at the massive stack of final notices and bills sitting on my kitchen counter. "Student loans, Grandma," I said. "They take up 80% of my day job salary. The diner pays for my rent and my groceries. It will take me 10 years, but I will pay them all off. I promise I am being responsible just like Mom and Dad taught me." Clara went perfectly still, the color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and horrified. She stared at me as if I was speaking a foreign language. "Sarah," she whispered. "What are you talking about? Where is the $80,000 I sent you?" The room felt like it was spinning rapidly. The cold air suddenly felt too thin to breathe. I blinked at her completely, unable to comprehend what she had just said. $80,000. I repeated the words slowly as if tasting them. "Grandma, what, $80,000? Now it was my turn to be completely confused. I sat back on my heels and looked at her. I told her exactly what happened 4 years ago on the very day I graduated from state college. My parents had taken me out for a cheap diner breakfast to celebrate. They slid a thin white envelope across the sticky table. Inside was a personal check for $500. My mother, Susan, had looked at me with a somber, deeply serious expression. She told me that Grandma Clara was living on a strict fixed income. She said that Clara wanted to give me a big grand gift, but simply could not afford it because of her medical expenses. Susan told me I needed to be extremely grateful for that $500 because it was a massive financial sacrifice for a widow to make. I told Clara that I had actually cried with gratitude that day at the diner. I used that $500 to buy my stiff polyester uniform for the waitress job and to pay my very first utility bill. I told Clara that I even wrote her a long, heartfelt thank you letter, detailing exactly how her generous gift helped me survive my first month of adulthood. I gave that sealed letter directly to my mother to mail to her since I did not have Clara's new updated address at the time. Clara listened to me explain this in absolute silence. With every single word I spoke, her face shifted from deep sorrow to a cold, terrifying rage. She closed her eyes for a long moment, taking a deep, rattling breath. She never received any thank you letter. My mother must have taken my heartfelt words and thrown them directly into the garbage. Clara opened her eyes and looked around my miserable, freezing apartment one more time. Then she looked back at me. "Sarah," she said, her voice now vibrating with a quiet, intense anger that scared me. "4 years ago, I sold your late grandfather's vintage car collection. He loved those cars, but I liquidated those precious assets specifically for you. I knew your parents favored Emily. I watched them ignore your needs your entire childhood while they handed your sister the world. I wanted to make sure you started your adult life completely debt-free. I wanted you to have a solid down payment for a safe, warm, beautiful home. I wired exactly $80,000 directly into the joint family bank account your parents control. The memo line specifically stated it was your college graduation gift. It was entirely for you." The silence in the room was completely deafening. I could hear the auto shop downstairs grinding a piece of heavy metal. I could hear my own ragged breathing catching in my throat. $80,000. My parents had watched me eat plain instant rice for weeks at a time because I could not afford groceries. They had watched me walk 2 miles to work in the freezing Chicago snow because I could not afford to fix the transmission on my rusted car. They had watched me develop dark, bruised bags under my eyes from chronic sleep deprivation, working 2 exhausting jobs. They had watched me slowly break under the crushing weight of my financial burdens. And all the while, they were sitting on $80,000 that rightfully, legally belonged to me. A massive gift from a loving grandmother who only wanted to see me safe and happy. I felt physically sick. My stomach churned wildly. The betrayal was so massive, so deeply intentionally cruel, that my brain severely struggled to process the magnitude of it. I asked Clara if she was absolutely sure. I asked if maybe there was a simple bank error or a miscommunication. Clara did not answer me with words. She reached down to the peeling linoleum floor and picked up her heavy leather purse. Her hands were no longer trembling. The fragile sick woman who had walked into my apartment just 10 minutes ago was completely gone. In her place was a fierce, furious matriarch who had just discovered that her own son and daughter-in-law had robbed her beloved granddaughter blind and left her to suffer in poverty. She pulled out her cell phone. She did not hesitate for even a single second. She dialed the direct private number for her senior wealth manager at the downtown bank. I sat on the floor and watched her put the phone on speaker. When the manager answered, Clara did not exchange any polite pleasantries. She demanded an urgent, expedited statement for the wire transfer from 4 years ago to be sent to her email immediately while she waited on the line. She demanded the exact routing numbers, the exact dates, and the exact destination of every single cent of that $80,000. My parents had spent 4 long years building a comfortable, arrogant life on a foundation of brutal lies and stolen money. But as Clara held that phone tightly in her hand, staring at the screen and waiting for the digital document to arrive, I knew one thing with absolute, undeniable certainty. Their entire fake charade was officially crumbling right to the ground. And the incoming fallout was going to destroy absolutely everything they thought they owned. We sat in the freezing silence of my kitchen, waiting for the email from the bank manager to arrive. The digital clock on my microwave blinked softly, marking the passing seconds. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes passed. Every single tick of that clock felt like a heavy hammer striking against my chest. Clara did not look away from her cell phone screen. Her knuckles were stark white from gripping the device so tightly. The heater in the corner of my apartment rattled weakly, blowing a thin stream of lukewarm air that did absolutely nothing to chase away the deep, bitter cold. To fill the agonizing silence, Clara began asking me sharp, direct questions about the past 4 years. She demanded to know exactly what my parents had said to me and exactly how they had behaved. I poured 2 mugs of cheap tap water and heated them in the microwave because I could not even afford a simple box of tea bags. I handed 1 warm mug to my grandmother. The heat radiating from the cheap ceramic was the only source of comfort in that miserable room. I sat down across from her and laid everything bare. I told her about the day my older sister, Emily, moved into her massive 5-bedroom house in the upscale suburbs. It was just 6 months after I had graduated from college with a mountain of student loans. My parents, Richard and Susan, had thrown a lavish housewarming party to celebrate Emily and her husband, Todd. I remembered standing in Emily's completely custom kitchen, wearing the only professional dress I owned, which I had bought from a thrift store. Susan was happily pouring expensive imported wine for Todd's wealthy corporate friends. Todd is a high-level financial broker. He is the kind of man who walks into a room like he personally owns the very floorboards you are standing on. That day, he wore a custom-tailored suit and a watch that probably cost more than my entire college tuition. He spent the entire afternoon talking loudly to anyone who would listen about his aggressive investment portfolios and his brilliant market strategies. During that extravagant party, I had quietly pulled my father aside in the hallway. I swallowed my tremendous pride and asked him if he could possibly co-sign a small, modest loan for me. I just needed a few $1,000s to buy a reliable used car so I could drive safely to my medical billing job instead of waiting for the city bus in the freezing snow. My father had looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and deep annoyance. He lowered his voice and told me that they had just helped Emily and Todd with a massive cash down payment for their new house. He said Emily absolutely needed to establish herself in a highly rated school district because she and Todd were planning to have beautiful children soon. He actually patted my shoulder and told me I was young and highly resilient. He told me that struggling in your 20s is what builds genuine character and grit. He told me to take the bus and be grateful I had a job at all. I recounted this painful memory to Clara, and her jaw tightened so hard, I genuinely thought her teeth might crack under the pressure. She asked me about Emily's incredibly extravagant country club wedding. The wedding with the imported white orchids, the professional wedding planner, and the live string quartet. I told Clara the absolute truth. I was not even asked to be a bridesmaid. My mother, Susan, had pulled me aside 2 months before the wedding and told me that Emily wanted a perfectly matched, visually stunning bridal party. Susan said my cheap, worn-out shoes and my exhausted appearance would completely ruin the professional photography they were paying thousands of dollars for. Instead of standing beside my sister, I was assigned to handle the guest book at the front entrance. I stood there for 4 hours, pasting on a fake smile for wealthy strangers, while my family celebrated joyously inside the grand ballroom. Clara slammed her hand down on my flimsy kitchen table. The cheap composite wood rattled violently under the force of her sudden anger. She looked me dead in the eyes and told me she had explicitly begged Richard to use a large portion of her savings to help me pay for my college textbooks when I was just a freshman. She had sent him checks specifically earmarked for my education expenses. I felt a hard lump form in my throat. I told her I never saw a single dime of that money. For 4 entire years, I bought outdated, torn editions of textbooks from the campus library clearance sale and spent hours hand-copying the missing pages in the library because I could not afford to buy the correct books. The horrifying realization hung heavy and deeply toxic in the chilled air of my apartment. I was not simply the spare child who was occasionally overlooked. I was the child they actively, willfully sacrificed to fund the golden child's absolute perfect life. My parents viewed Emily as a high-yield investment, and they viewed me as a complete, total write-off. Todd, the arrogant, wealthy broker, was the perfect son-in-law they could brag about to their shallow friends at church. A struggling, tired waitress and medical biller was a stain on their pristine suburban reputation. They did not just ignore me, they deliberately stole the very tools I needed to survive. Then the sharp, high-pitched chime of Clara's cell phone abruptly pierced the silence in the room. The email from the senior bank manager had finally arrived. My heart hammered against my ribs like a desperately trapped bird. Clara placed the phone flat on the kitchen table directly between us. Her hands were shaking far too much to hold the device steady. I leaned in close, my shoulder pressing tightly against hers. She tapped the screen with a trembling finger to open the encrypted document. The bank statement loaded slowly, line by line. I stared at the bright white screen, my tired eyes scanning the dense rows of numbers, transactions, and dates. We looked for the exact day 4 years ago. The exact day Clara had wired the massive, life-changing sum of $80,000 from her personal life savings directly into the joint checking account managed by Richard and Susan. We found it. The transaction was clearly, plainly listed. An incoming wire transfer for exactly $80,000. And right there in the official bank record, the memo explicitly read, Sarah's college and future. I felt a deep physical ache in my throat, seeing my own name securely attached to that kind of wealth. Money that would have completely effortlessly erased my crushing student loan debt in one single day. Money that would have bought me a safe, reliable car to drive to work. Money that would have allowed me to sleep for 8 hours a normal night, instead of working grueling double shifts until my body literally gave out. But the very next line on the bank statement was the one that made the blood in my veins run completely cold. Exactly 48 hours after Clara's massive wire transfer had cleared the joint account, there was a huge outgoing transfer. It was an outbound wire for the exact same amount. $80,000. Not a penny more and not a penny less. My eyes tracked nervously across the glowing screen to read the final destination of the outbound funds. The money did not go to a high-yield savings account set up for me. It did not go to a general family emergency fund to be held in trust. It did not go to anything even remotely related to my name. The destination account was listed as a private investment trust. And right there in bold black digital ink was the legally registered name of the receiving trust fund, the Todd and Emily Family Trust. The air was completely knocked out of my burning lungs. I read the name again and again, desperately hoping my exhausted eyes were simply playing a cruel trick on me. I prayed I was misreading the text, but the letters did not change. Todd and Emily, my golden sister and my arrogant, condescending brother-in-law. My parents had not just withheld the graduation money from me to keep for their own selfish retirement. They had actively illegally stolen my graduation gift directly from my grandmother and handed it straight to Emily and Todd on a silver platter. They used my financial future to buy Emily a massive luxury suburban house. They used my absolute security to fund Todd's flashy, wealthy lifestyle. They allowed me to freeze in a rundown, dangerous apartment above a noisy auto body shop while they drank expensive imported wine and laughed together about how deeply resilient and independent I was. A hot, sickening wave of pure, unadulterated rage washed over my entire body. For 26 years, I had constantly made excuses for my parents. I had rationalized their obvious, blatant favoritism. I had convinced my own heart that they loved me in their own quiet, distant way, but simply related better to Emily. I had swallowed every single insult, every subtle, nasty dig, and every holiday exclusion. I had blamed myself for not being good enough, smart enough, or successful enough to earn their love. But this was not favoritism. This was a crime. This was theft. This was a calculated, malicious, and deeply evil betrayal. I jumped up from the floor. My chair scraped loudly and harshly against the peeling linoleum. I reached for my own cell phone sitting on the chipped kitchen counter. My fingers were trembling so violently I could barely swipe to unlock the screen. I looked at Clara and told her I was calling Richard right this exact second. I wanted to scream at him until my throat bled. I wanted to hear him try to explain how he could look me directly in the eye at a cheap diner, hand me a pathetic $500 check, and lie to my face that my grandmother was broke while he was secretly wiring $80,000 of my own money to Todd's private trust fund. I had my father's contact pulled up on my screen. My thumb hovered aggressively over the green call button. "Sarah, stop right now." Clara's voice was not loud, but it carried a terrifying razor-sharp edge of absolute authority. I froze looking down at her. She was not crying anymore. The profound shock and the deep sorrow that had completely broken her when she first walked into my miserable apartment were entirely gone. Her brown eyes were narrow, highly focused, and incredibly dangerous. She reached out with a steady hand and gently pushed my phone down toward the kitchen counter. "We do not call them," she said quietly, her voice radiating a chilling calm. "If you call Richard right now, he will panic. He will hang up the phone. He will immediately call Susan, and they will immediately call Todd." She stood up slowly, leaning on her cane, but looking 10 feet tall. "Todd is a high-level financial broker, Sarah. He moves massive amounts of money for a living. He knows every loophole, every trick, and every single blind spot in the banking system. If we give them even one single hour of advance warning, Todd will bury that $80,000 so deep in offshore shell accounts or untraceable complex investments that we will never, ever find it again. They will completely cover their tracks, destroy the paper trails, and gaslight you into thinking you are genuinely crazy." I stared at her, the cold, hard realization slowly sinking into my angry, burning brain. She was absolutely right. Susan was a master at twisting the truth to fit her narrative. If I confronted them blindly without a solid, unshakable legal strategy, Susan would somehow turn it around and make me the ultimate villain. She would march into the church on Sunday and tell the entire congregation that I was harassing them for money I never earned. Todd would hire a team of extremely expensive corporate lawyers to completely crush me in court. I was a waitress living paycheck to paycheck. I could not fight a wealthy, connected finance broker in a simple shouting match. "We sit in the dark." Clara instructed, her voice hard and smooth as polished stone. "We let them keep thinking they have completely gotten away with their crime. We let them keep smiling smugly at their fancy country club dinners and driving their luxury SUVs paid for with your future. We let them truly believe you are still the quiet, submissive, spare daughter who never asks any questions. I felt a cold shiver run directly down my spine. The sweet grandmother I had known my entire life was a gentle, soft-spoken woman who baked cookies and knitted warm blankets for the winter. The woman standing in my kitchen right now was a seasoned, hardened matriarch actively preparing for a brutal war. What do we do then? I asked, my voice dropping to an anxious, tight whisper. Clara picked up her cell phone from the table. She closed the banking application and opened her private contact list. She scrolled quickly past the family phone numbers, past her medical doctors, and past her friends from the senior center. She stopped firmly on a specific contact listed only as Harrison Legal Group. "We follow the money," Clara said, looking up at me with eyes full of burning justice. "Todd thinks he is incredibly smart because he plays games with other people's wealth all day long. But Richard and Susan are arrogant and sloppy. You do not move $80,000 without leaving a massive, undeniable financial footprint. If Todd set up a private trust specifically to receive stolen funds from his father-in-law, he committed federal tax fraud. If Richard forged my financial intent to redirect those funds to himself, he committed grand larceny and severe elder financial abuse." She pressed the green call button and put the phone to her ear. I stood perfectly still in the freezing kitchen, listening to the dial tone ring through the small internal speaker. My entire worldview, my entire understanding of my place in this family had been completely, permanently shattered in the span of 30 painful minutes. The parents I thought simply did not understand me were actually ruthless thieves who had intentionally, viciously robbed me of my entire future. The ringing stopped. A sharp, highly professional voice answered on the other end of the line. "Hello, Arthur," Clara said, her tone completely void of any familial warmth or polite pleasantries. "I need you to drop absolutely whatever you are doing right now. I need you to run a complete covert forensic asset trace on my son Richard Jenkins and his son-in-law Todd. I want to see every single tax return, every hidden shell corporation, and every single property deed attached to their names for the last 4 consecutive years." She paused, listening for a brief moment, her eyes locked onto mine, fierce and completely unyielding. "It is time to review all of Richard's money flows." She listened for another moment. "Yes, Arthur," she replied, her voice dripping with an icy, absolute resolve that made my breath catch. "It is exactly what we feared, but they made a fatal, massive mistake. They left a paper trail, and we are going to use it to burn them to the ground." Clara ended the call and set the phone face down on the table with a sharp, final click. She looked at my worn-out, cheap shoes, my patched jacket, and my bare, depressing kitchen cupboards. Then she reached out and took my hand, squeezing it so tightly I could feel the pulse of her own racing heart. "They stole your future, Sarah," she promised, her voice fierce and completely unwavering. "Now we are going to take away theirs." I parked my sputtering 10-year-old sedan a full block away from my parents' immaculate suburban house. The transmission was slipping so badly that the car shuddered violently with every gear change, but I desperately needed that mechanical failure today. It was the perfect, undeniable excuse for my visit. I sat in the freezing driver's seat for a long moment, letting the engine tick and cool in the bitter Chicago air. I reached into my faded winter coat and felt the cold, hard shape of my cell phone. I pressed the record button on the voice memo application and slipped the device deep into my breast pocket. My grandmother Clara and I had agreed that confronting them blindly would be a fatal mistake. We needed undeniable, legally binding proof of their cruelty and their financial fraud. I needed them to put their arrogant lies completely on the record. I walked up the perfectly manicured driveway. Parked right in the center, gleaming brightly under the expensive security lights, was the brand new luxury SUV that my sister Emily and her husband Todd had just purchased. The dealership tags were still on the back window. It was a vehicle that cost more than I made in 2 entire years of working grueling double shifts at the diner and the medical billing office. The sheer audacity of it made my stomach turn. I walked past it feeling the deep, heavy weight of what I was about to do. I stepped onto the expansive wraparound porch and rang the heavy brass doorbell. My mother, Susan, opened the door wearing a plush cashmere sweater and holding a delicate glass of white wine. Her warm, practiced smile immediately vanished the exact second she saw my worn-out boots and my exhausted face. She looked quickly up and down the street, as if nervously checking to see if any of her wealthy neighbors were watching her interact with someone who looked like a vagrant. "Sarah," she said, her voice tight, with immediate sharp annoyance. "We were not expecting you today. What exactly are you doing here on a Sunday afternoon?" I forced my shoulders to slump, playing the role of the desperate, broken daughter they always expected me to be. "Mom, I am so sorry to drop in like this," I said, making my voice waver perfectly. "My car transmission is completely giving out. I barely made it here. I cannot get to my medical billing job tomorrow, and if I miss another shift, they will definitely fire me. I am begging you. I just need a short-term loan of $1,000 to get the car fixed. I will pay you back every single cent. I promise." Susan let out a long, dramatic sigh and stepped back to let me into the massive foyer. The house smelled of expensive vanilla candles and roasted garlic. It was warm and deeply comfortable, an incredibly stark contrast to my freezing, run-down apartment. My father, Richard, walked out of the living room holding the television remote. When he saw me standing there asking for help, his face hardened into a mask of pure irritation. Susan crossed her arms, looking at me with absolute icy condescension. "Sarah, we have talked about this," she said, her voice dripping with fake maternal concern. "We are living on a very tight budget right now. You know how hard the economy is. We simply do not have $1,000 to hand out every time you totally mismanage your finances." "But there is a brand new luxury SUV sitting right in your driveway," I said, keeping my tone pleading and completely oblivious. I thought maybe things were going much better for the family. Richard scoffed loudly, stepping forward to stand next to my mother. "That vehicle belongs to Todd and Emily," he said proudly. "Todd earned that with his brilliant financial investments. They are building a life, a real stable future. You need to learn how to be completely independent, Sarah. We cannot keep bailing you out forever. We do not have any extra money hiding in the walls. You need to pull yourself up and build character." My phone was actively recording every single word, every lie, every cruel, arrogant justification. I looked at the two people who had stolen $80,000 of my graduation money and listened to them tell me they were totally broke. I nodded slowly, looking down at the imported hardwood floor. "You are right," I whispered. "I am sorry to bother you. Could I just get a quick glass of tap water before I walk to the bus stop?" Susan rolled her eyes, visibly annoyed that I was extending my visit by even 3 minutes. "Fine," she snapped. "Wait right here. Do not track mud onto the expensive living room rug." She turned and walked down the long hallway toward the custom kitchen. Richard immediately lost interest in my misery. He turned around and walked back into the living room, turning the volume up loudly on his weekend golf tournament. This was exactly what I had prayed for, the absolute profound arrogance of my parents. They thought I was so beaten down, so completely compliant, that they did not even bother to watch me in their own home. The moment they were both entirely out of sight, I moved. I did not walk toward the kitchen. I slipped silently down the opposite hallway, directly toward Richard's home office. My heart was pounding a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribs. My palms were sweating, making it incredibly hard to grip the smooth brass doorknob. The office door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and slipped inside, pulling the heavy door almost entirely shut behind me. The room was lined with dark mahogany bookshelves, and a massive oak desk sat squarely in the center. I knew my father well. I knew he was fiercely protective of his financial documents, but I also knew he was incredibly deeply disorganized. He relied heavily on Todd to handle the complex moving parts of their money, while he simply kept the physical receipts to feel important. I moved rapidly behind the massive oak desk. My eyes scanned the chaotic piles of paper stacked near his expensive leather chair. I saw standard utility bills, bank notices, and country club membership renewals. I began lifting the thick stacks carefully, making absolutely sure to keep them in their original, pristine order. I only had maybe 2 minutes before Susan returned to the foyer with my glass of water. If she caught me in here, the entire plan would be completely destroyed. Underneath a thick pile of golfing magazines, I found exactly what Clara and I were aggressively searching for. It was a thick manila folder, clearly labeled with Todd's investment firm logo. I opened the heavy cover and my eyes widened in absolute shock. Right on top were the official tax receipts for the shell corporation Richard and Todd had fraudulently created. The company was literally registered under my mother's maiden name. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, left the voice memo running, and quickly opened my camera application. I snapped clear, high-resolution photos of the federal tax identification numbers, the massive balance sheets, and the explicit transfer logs showing exactly how my $80,000 had been illegally washed through this fake business to deliberately avoid IRS gift taxes. But as I flipped frantically to the second page of the hidden folder, I saw something else entirely. Something that made the blood in my veins completely freeze over. It was a large collection of credit card statements, platinum premium tier cards with massive spending limits. I looked closely at the name printed in bold black letters across the top of the billing summary. The name was Sarah Jenkins, my exact name. My hands started to shake so violently, the camera actively blurred. I forced myself to take a deep, shuddering breath, steadying my hands to capture the image. These were not old, inactive accounts. These were active, heavily utilized credit cards. The statement showed tens of thousands of dollars in luxury purchases. Designer clothes, expensive, extravagant dinners, out vacations to tropical coastal resorts, and massive direct payments to Emily's elite interior decorator. For years, I had been repeatedly rejected for simple used car loans and basic apartment leases because my credit score was inexplicably terrible. I had always assumed it was simply because of my massive student loan debt. I had spent countless exhausted nights crying in the dark, wondering why I could never get ahead. The sickening truth was sitting right in front of me in my father's desk drawer. They did not just steal my graduation gift, they had literally aggressively stolen my entire identity. My own parents had used my social security number to secretly open fraudulent credit lines, completely destroying my financial reputation to comfortably fund their lavish lifestyle and protect their own credit scores. They were bleeding me dry from every conceivable angle while actively publicly lecturing me about financial responsibility. A hot, blinding fury flooded my chest. I wanted to march into the living room and tear the pristine house apart. I wanted to hold these stolen statements up in their faces and scream until my voice gave out. But I remembered Clara's stern warning. We do not confront them blindly. We build a legal cage they can never escape. I snapped 10 more rapid photos capturing every single account number, every fraudulent massive balance, and every itemized list of their stolen luxury purchases. I carefully placed the papers exactly how I had found them. I closed the manila folder, slid it smoothly back under the golfing magazines, and completely erased any trace of my presence behind the desk. Sarah, where are you? Susan's sharp voice echoed loudly from the kitchen hallway. My pulse skyrocketed instantly. I darted out from behind the desk, crossed the room in 2 long silent strides, and slipped out the office door. I walked rapidly back to the foyer, arriving just as Susan rounded the corner holding a small plastic cup of tap water. She did not even give me a real glass. Here, she said, shoving the cheap plastic cup toward me. Now drink this and get going. Your father is trying to watch his tournament, and we are having Todd and Emily over for a private dinner tonight. I took the plastic cup, my hands still trembling fiercely with adrenaline and pure rage. I drank the cold water, staring directly into my mother's eyes. I wondered how she could possibly look at her own flesh and blood, knowing she was actively destroying my life with fake credit cards and stolen money. Her face held absolutely no guilt. She looked completely, totally bored. Thank you, Mom, I said, keeping my voice perfectly submissive. I will figure out the car. You are completely right. I need to be independent. That is the spirit, she replied, offering a tight, fake smile as she opened the heavy front door to usher me out. Work hard, Sarah. It truly builds character. I stepped off the porch and walked back down the long, pristine driveway. I passed the gleaming luxury SUV that I was currently paying for with my completely ruined credit score. I did not look back at the massive house. I kept my head down, walking block after block until I finally reached my broken-down sedan. I climbed into the freezing driver's seat and slammed the heavy door shut. I locked the doors and let out a massive, ragged breath. My entire body was shaking. I pulled my phone from my pocket and stopped the audio recording. I had it. I had the explicit verbal refusal, the blatant lies about their finances, and the photographic evidence of massive federal tax fraud and aggressive identity theft. I had the keys to their complete total destruction right in the palm of my hand. I put the keys in the ignition and turned the engine over. The car sputtered and choked wildly, protesting the cold, but finally roared to life. I reached to put the car in drive, eager to get back to my apartment and show Clara the absolute goldmine of federal evidence I had just secured. Then, my phone screen lit up brightly, illuminating the dark, cold car cabin. It was a high-priority text message alert, but it was not from Clara. It was an automated severe fraud alert from the private banking institution that held Clara's massive retirement portfolio. Since I had been legally designated as her temporary power of attorney just 48 hours ago, the bank had immediately set up dual authorization alerts for any major transactions on her personal accounts. I stared at the glowing screen, my breath completely catching in my dry throat. The message read, "Urgent security alert. An unauthorized attempt to transfer $200,000 from the Clara Jenkins Retirement Trust is currently pending. Initiating party listed as Todd Miller Financial Advisory Group." The blood drained completely from my face. I read the notification again, my mind racing wildly to comprehend the sheer aggressive speed of what was actively happening. Todd was not just quietly managing their stolen money. He was actively making a move to aggressively drain the rest of my grandmother's life savings. They must have completely panicked when Clara asked about the $80,000. They must have realized that she was starting to put the pieces together. Instead of apologizing or covering their tracks, they had decided to go for the absolute brutal kill. Todd was trying to liquidate her massive retirement fund right out from under her before she could legally change her banking passwords. They were trying to leave an ailing 78-year-old stroke survivor completely, totally destitute, just to perfectly protect their own wealthy facade. I gripped the freezing steering wheel so hard, my knuckles popped in the cold air. The evidence in my phone was no longer just about seeking legal justice for my stolen graduation gift or my deeply ruined credit score. This was now a desperate high-stakes race against time. Todd had crossed a massive illegal line, and he was actively committing severe elder financial abuse in real time. I threw the car into drive and slammed my foot aggressively on the gas pedal. The broken transmission shuddered violently, but the car surged forward quickly into the darkening suburban streets. The trap had to be sprung immediately. Todd thought he was a brilliant, untouchable financial genius, secretly moving money in the shadows. He had absolutely no idea that I could clearly see every single illegal move he was making. Clara and her bank manager had successfully locked down the retirement accounts the exact second we saw the fraud alert. Todd's desperate attempt to drain my grandmother's life savings had failed completely, but he had absolutely no idea that we were the ones who had blocked the transaction. He likely assumed it was a standard weekend security hold. I had to play my part perfectly to keep him completely in the dark. The very next afternoon was the grand weekend barbecue at Emily and Todd's sprawling new estate in the affluent northern suburbs. I pulled my battered, sputtering sedan up to the curb. The pristine driveway was already packed to the brim with luxury vehicles belonging to Todd's wealthy parents and his country club friends. I sat in my car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew exactly what they had done. I had the photographs of the fraudulent tax returns and the stolen credit card statements safely backed up on a secure cloud server. I knew they were thieves, but today I needed the final piece of the puzzle. I needed them to verbally admit to the theft of the $80,000. I needed a clear, undeniable audio recording of my mother confessing to the crime. I reached into the pocket of my cheap denim jacket and wrapped my fingers tightly around my cell phone, practicing the exact physical motion of pressing the record button without looking. I walked around the side of the massive house and pushed open the heavy wooden gate leading to the backyard. The scene in front of me looked like a photograph pulled directly from a wealthy lifestyle magazine. The expansive, perfectly manicured lawn was dotted with pristine white patio furniture. A string quartet played soft classical music in the corner. My sister Emily was gliding through the crowd, wearing a designer silk sundress, holding a delicate crystal glass of imported sparkling water. My parents, Richard and Susan, were standing near the massive custom-built outdoor kitchen, mingling effortlessly with Todd's wealthy parents, William and Diane. The sharp contrast between their opulent reality and my daily miserable struggle made a hot wave of bile rise in my throat. Just 12 hours ago, I had finished a grueling night shift at the diner, scraping dried syrup off tables just to afford a tank of gas. And here they were drinking expensive champagne paid for with my stolen future. Sarah, you actually made it. The loud booming voice belonged to Todd. He was standing behind a massive stainless steel grill, flipping thick, expensive steaks with an incredibly arrogant smirk on his face. He wore tailored khaki shorts and a crisp linen button-down shirt. He looked like the absolute master of the universe. I forced my facial muscles to relax into a polite, tired smile. I walked over to the patio area where my parents and Todd's parents were gathered. Susan looked me up and down, her eyes lingering harshly on my faded jacket and my scuffed shoes. Her jaw tightened with immediate visible annoyance. She hated whenever I looked poor in front of Todd's family. It completely ruined the perfect, successful image she worked so hard to project. Sarah, dear? Susan said, her voice dripping with fake, sugary sweetness. We are so glad you could take a quick break from your little jobs to join us. William and Diane were just asking about you. William, Todd's father, looked at me with a mixture of pity and mild disdain. Todd tells us you are still working at that 24-hour diner, he said, swirling the amber liquid in his cocktail glass. Have you thought about going back to school? A young woman your age really needs to start thinking about building a solid financial portfolio. Todd laughed loudly, flipping another steak. I keep telling her, William. I tell her all the time. Hard work is great, but you absolutely need to know how to leverage capital. You can work 80 hours a week scrubbing tables, but if you do not have assets working for you in the background, you will simply be poor forever. It is all about financial literacy, Sarah. You have to be smart with your money. The sheer absolute audacity of his lecture nearly caused my knees to buckle. This man had literally stolen $80,000 from my grandmother, washed it through a fake shell corporation registered in my mother's name, and was currently standing in $1 million backyard lecturing me about financial literacy. Richard chimed in, nodding vigorously in agreement with Todd. Todd is absolutely right, Sarah. You need to listen to him. He has built an incredible life for your sister. It takes real grit and serious intelligence to generate this kind of wealth. We are just so incredibly proud of the empire Todd and Emily are building. I stood there gripping a cheap plastic cup of ice water, feeling the adrenaline begin to flood my entire nervous system. I looked directly at Todd and then shifted my gaze slowly to my father and finally to my mother. The time for playing the quiet, submissive victim was over. The trap needed to be sprung. Well, Todd, I said, my voice carrying clearly over the soft classical music playing in the background. I suppose you are right about leveraging capital, but it certainly helps when you do not have to actually earn that capital yourself. It must be incredibly easy to build a massive real estate portfolio when you just stumble into a magical $80,000 windfall exactly 4 years ago. The reaction was instantaneous and completely beautiful. Todd froze completely still. The expensive metal spatula slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly against the stainless steel grill. Richard physically choked on his beer, violently coughing and sputtering as the liquid caught in his throat. Susan's face instantly drained of all color, turning a sickening shade of chalky white. Her eyes went wide with absolute sheer terror. William looked around the silent patio, completely confused by the sudden drastic shift in the atmosphere. Windfall, he asked, his brow furrowing. What windfall? Todd, I thought you built your initial investment fund from your early brokerage bonuses. Todd opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked like a deer trapped in the blinding headlights of an oncoming freight train. He stared at me, his arrogant smirk entirely, completely erased. Before Todd could scramble to formulate a convincing lie, Susan lunged forward. She moved with a desperate, frantic energy, completely abandoning her dignified, wealthy, matriarch persona. She grabbed me roughly by the upper arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging painfully deep into my skin through the denim of my jacket. Sarah. She hissed, her voice a panicked, breathless whisper. You need to come help me in the kitchen, right this exact second. We need to check on the appetizers. She did not wait for my answer. She forcefully yanked my arm, dragging me away from the patio and pulling me rapidly toward the heavy glass doors leading into Emily's massive marble kitchen. I let her drag me. I did not fight back, because this was exactly where I needed to be. As we crossed the threshold into the quiet, empty kitchen, I slipped my free hand deep into my jacket pocket. I felt the smooth surface of my cell phone screen and firmly pressed the record button. A tiny vibration confirmed the application was successfully running. Susan slammed the glass door shut behind us, ensuring it was completely closed so the wealthy in-laws on the patio could not hear a single word. She spun around to face me, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a toxic, malicious fury. "What is wrong with your sick mind?" she demanded, her voice shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. "How dare you come into your sister's beautiful home and say something like that in front of William and Diane? Are you completely out of your mind?" I stood my ground, looking down at the woman who had happily destroyed my entire youth. "I am not crazy, Mom," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and steady. "I know exactly what you did. Grandma Clara visited my apartment yesterday. She realized I never got the graduation money. She called her bank manager right in front of me. I saw the official bank statement, Mom. I know she wired $80,000 to your joint account, and I know Dad transferred every single penny of it to a private trust fund controlled by Todd and Emily just 48 hours later." Susan took a sharp, ragged breath, stepping back as if I had physically struck her. The absolute denial she usually relied on was completely useless here. She knew she was caught, but instead of showing even a single ounce of remorse or guilt, her face hardened into a mask of bitter, cruel resentment. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat," she spat, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You have absolutely no idea how the real world works. Your grandmother was completely foolish and senile with her savings. She was throwing away $80,000 on a girl who works at a dirty diner. You would have completely wasted that money on cheap rent and useless groceries. It was my money," I said, my voice rising just enough to capture clearly on the hidden recording. "It was a graduation gift legally given to me." "You stole it. You stole $80,000 to buy Emily a house." "We did not steal anything," Susan hissed furiously, stepping into my personal space. "We made a necessary executive family decision. Todd actually knows how to multiply wealth. Todd knows how to handle real capital. We redirected those funds to secure your sister's future because she actually has one. You do not deserve that money, Sarah. You did not deserve it 4 years ago, and you absolutely do not deserve it now. It is family money, and we are the heads of this family. We decided where it went to maximize the return. You are just a bitter, jealous failure trying to ruin your sister's perfect life because you cannot fix your own." I stared at her, letting her toxic, hateful words hang in the heavy air of the kitchen. She had said it. She had explicitly, clearly confessed to redirecting the funds. She had verbally acknowledged the exact amount, and she had aggressively confirmed their malicious intent. She had openly admitted that they stole the money simply because they believed I was worthless. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold, hard weight of the cell phone in my pocket. The recording was crystal clear. The trap had firmly, securely closed completely around them. "You are right, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a cool, detached whisper. "I suppose I really do not understand how your version of the real world works, but I promise you, I am learning very quickly." I turned my back on her, leaving her standing in the center of the lavish marble kitchen. I did not say another word. I walked straight out the front door of the massive house, ignoring the confused stares of the arriving party guests. I climbed into my beaten-down, sputtering car and locked the doors. I pulled my phone from my pocket and stopped the recording. I played back the final 30 seconds, listening to Susan's cruel, arrogant confession fill the small cabin of my car. I saved the audio file to 3 separate cloud servers and sent a secure encrypted copy directly to Clara's private attorney. The war had officially started and my parents had already completely lost. The heavy mahogany doors of the downtown law firm closed behind us, sealing us inside a soundproof conference room that felt miles away from my freezing, run-down apartment. Clara and I sat on one side of a massive glass table. Across from us sat Robert, a seasoned forensic accountant, and David, a ruthless real estate attorney. I had spent my entire life feeling incredibly small and powerless, but sitting in that high-rise office looking at the thick files stacked between us, I finally felt a shift in the universe. We were no longer simply reacting to my parents' cruelty. We were actively, methodically building a trap that would completely destroy their fake empire. Robert opened the first file and spread the printed photographs I had taken of Richard's desk across the smooth glass surface. He did not look at me with pity. He looked at the documents with the sharp, predatory focus of a man who hunted white-collar criminals for a living. Clara sat beside me, gripping her wooden cane, her posture perfectly straight and completely unwavering. Robert explained exactly how Todd and my parents had orchestrated the massive theft. It was not just a simple wire transfer. It was a highly coordinated federal crime designed to completely bypass taxation and obscure the origin of the stolen money. Todd needed seed capital for a massive commercial real estate flip, but he was heavily overleveraged on his other luxury properties. He could not secure a traditional bank loan without triggering a massive financial audit of his brokerage firm. So, my father Richard stepped in to play the willing, enthusiastic accomplice. Richard and Susan set up an unregistered shell limited liability company using my mother's maiden name. They actively funneled my grandmother's $80,000 graduation gift through this fake entity. To the Internal Revenue Service, they officially classified the stolen money as a short-term business loan to Todd's financial advisory group. This deliberate classification allowed Todd to entirely dodge the massive federal gift taxes and completely bypass standard income reporting. But the absolute worst part, the detail that completely stopped the breath in my lungs, was the credit cards. David, the real estate and financial attorney, slid another thick stack of papers toward me. He explained that my parents had completely stolen my social security number to open premium platinum credit lines. They used my clean, blank slate of a credit history to artificially inflate their own credit utilization ratios. Every single luxury dinner, every custom piece of furniture for Emily's 5-bedroom house, every tropical vacation they took while I was serving cherry pie at the diner on the night shift was funded by completely destroying my financial future. They had maxed out 6 different cards in my name, leaving me to shoulder the invisible burden of their massive hidden debt. I sat in that plush leather chair, feeling a wave of profound, intense nausea wash over my entire body. I thought about the sheer number of times I had cried alone in my car because my debit card was declined for a $20 tank of gas. I thought about my mother lecturing me on the absolute value of hard work and fierce independence while she was literally wearing designer clothes paid for by my stolen identity. Clara reached over and placed her warm, fragile hand entirely over mine. She did not shed a single tear. The sorrow of the previous day had completely burned away, leaving nothing but pure, hardened steel. She simply looked at David and Robert and asked exactly how long it would take to build a concrete, inescapable legal cage around her own son. David leaned back in his chair, his expression completely serious and deeply focused. He told us that we already had the audio recording of Susan explicitly confessing to the malicious redirection of the funds. We had the photographic evidence of the shell corporation and the fraudulent credit accounts. We had the original bank statements proving the exact wire transfer. But to ensure they could never slip away or hire their way out of this, we needed to quietly freeze their financial perimeter. Robert had already flagged the fraudulent credit accounts with the major credit bureaus, locking down my social security number and triggering an automatic internal fraud investigation. We were going to let the automated banking systems strike the very first blow. The trap began to actively snap shut less than 48 hours later. My parents and Todd had grown incredibly comfortable in their arrogant, wealthy bubble. They believed they were completely untouchable because they had gotten away with their cruelty for so long. But arrogant people always make careless, desperate mistakes when their cash flow is suddenly violently threatened. I was sitting in the break room at the medical billing office, staring at a lukewarm cup of coffee when my phone buzzed heavily against the plastic table. It was a detailed text message from David, updating me on the first phase of our attack. He informed me that Richard and Susan had just attempted to secure a massive bridge loan from their primary suburban bank. Todd desperately needed another influx of cash to cover a failing commercial investment, and he had pressured my parents to leverage their home and the fake shell corporation to guarantee the new loan. They walked into that bank expecting royal treatment and immediate compliance, but the bank algorithms had immediately kicked back a severe high-level red flag. Because Robert had frozen my fraudulently obtained credit profiles and officially initiated the federal identity theft protocols, the entire financial network connecting my parents to Todd was suddenly under intense automatic scrutiny. The bank did not just deny the massive bridge loan, they instantly triggered a highly sensitive security protocol. They immediately placed a temporary administrative freeze on my parents' primary checking and savings accounts, pending a basic overall security review. Richard and Susan were totally locked out of their money. Their debit cards were instantly declined. Their scheduled mortgage payments were suddenly frozen. Panic is a deeply dangerous emotion for people who are entirely used to being in absolute control. They did not know the federal tax authorities were secretly reviewing their shell company. They did not know about the forensic accountant tracking their every move. They only knew that Clara was completely ignoring their frantic phone calls that their bank accounts were suddenly totally inaccessible, and that I had walked out of Emily's kitchen after recording Susan saying things she deeply regretted. They needed someone to blame for the sudden, terrifying loss of control, and they needed someone weak to manipulate. The relentless pounding on my apartment door started exactly at 9 o'clock that evening. The freezing Chicago wind was rattling my thin cardboard-taped windows, making the entire rundown building groan. I was wrapping myself in a cheap fleece blanket trying to stay warm when the heavy, aggressive knocks echoed loudly through my tiny living space. I walked slowly to the door and looked through the scratched, blurry peephole. Richard and Susan were standing in the dim, flickering light of the dirty hallway. They did not look like the confident, wealthy suburbanites they had played at the barbecue just days prior. Richard's expensive tie was loosened and his face was deeply flushed with an angry, desperate color. Susan looked entirely frantic. Her pristine cashmere sweater was slightly wrinkled, and her eyes darted nervously around the filthy hallway, clearly terrified that someone might see her standing in such a poor, depressing building. They were completely cornered, and they had come to force me to fix their shattered reality. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open just a few inches, leaving the heavy metal security chain securely attached. I looked at them with a blank, completely empty expression. I did not invite them inside. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply stared at the two people who had ruined my youth and waited for them to speak. "Sarah, open this door right now!" Richard demanded, his voice a harsh, vibrating growl that he always used to terrify me when I was a child. "We need to talk to you about your absolutely unacceptable, disrespectful behavior at your sister's house." Susan pushed her way in front of him, completely changing her tactic to play the deeply wounded victim. She put on a mask of pure maternal concern, her face twisting into an expression of fake, profound sadness. "Sarah, please, honey, let us in," she pleaded, her voice dripping with calculated desperation. "We are just so incredibly worried about you. You have been acting so strangely lately, and your grandmother is completely losing her mind. She is not answering anyone. We need to figure this out together as a family before things get completely out of hand." I reached up and unlatched the heavy metal chain, swinging the door open wide. I wanted them to step fully into my freezing, miserable reality. I wanted them to stand on the peeling linoleum floor they had deliberately forced me to live on. They stepped inside immediately shivering as the bitter draft hit their shoulders. Susan looked around the cramped, barren studio with obvious, blatant disgust, crinkling her nose at the smell of the auto body shop downstairs. Richard did not waste any time pretending to care about my living conditions. He stepped directly into my personal space, trying to use his physical size to aggressively intimidate me the exact way he had done my entire life. "What exactly did you say to your grandmother?" he demanded furiously, jabbing a finger in the air. "She is refusing to answer my phone calls. Her bank is refusing to release her medical trust funds to my control, and our own personal accounts are suddenly locked down for a ridiculous security review. Did you tell her some kind of ridiculous, vicious lie about the graduation money?" I looked directly into his angry, flushed face. I felt my pulse racing wildly, but my voice remained perfectly deadpan and incredibly smooth. "I did not tell her any lies, Dad," I said, matching his intense stare. "I simply told her the absolute truth. I told her you only gave me a $500 check at the diner. She called the bank manager herself. She pulled the official wire transfers. She saw exactly where the $80,000 went, and she knows exactly who took it." Susan let out a loud, highly theatrical gasp, pressing her hand flat against her chest as if she had just been physically struck by a heavy blow. "Sarah, you completely misunderstood what happened," she cried out, her voice taking on a shrill, desperate pitch. "I was highly stressed in Emily's kitchen the other day. I misspoke out of pure anger. You took my words entirely out of context. We did not steal anything from you or from Clara. That money was always strictly intended to be a general family investment fund. Clara is old, and her memory is completely failing her. She is incredibly confused about what she actually originally wanted to do with her savings." The absolute sheer audacity of her gaslighting was breathtaking. She was standing directly in the freezing poverty she had deliberately condemned me to, actively trying to convince me that the clear audio recording I had of her explicitly confessing to theft was simply a minor verbal misunderstanding. She truly believed I was stupid enough and desperate enough for her approval to accept this ridiculous, completely fabricated lie. Richard pointed a thick, angry finger directly at my face, his eyes wide and threatening. "You are going to fix this massive mess, Sarah. You are going to call Clara right now and tell her you made a massive emotional mistake. You are going to tell her that Todd is actively growing her investment and that she needs to immediately sign this official authorization form, releasing her assets back into my complete legal control." He reached into his inside jacket pocket, pulled out a crumpled, highly official-looking legal document, and slammed it down onto my tiny kitchen counter right next to my single, sad jar of peanut butter. It was a sweeping power of attorney document that would grant Richard full, unlimited access to Clara's remaining life savings. They were completely, totally desperate. The unexpected bank freeze had backed them firmly into a dark corner, and they were trying to use pure emotional terrorism to force me to open the cage and let them back into her money. "If you do not fix this right now," Richard threatened, his voice dropping to a vicious, sinister whisper, "you are going to absolutely destroy this entire family." Todd is on the verge of closing a massive commercial deal. If our accounts remain frozen, the entire deal completely collapses and Emily could lose her beautiful home. Do you really want to be the sole reason your own pregnant sister is thrown out on the street? Do you want to be the bitter, jealous sibling who completely ruins everything because you simply cannot handle the pressure of hard work? I stared down at the blank authorization form sitting on my cheap counter. They were entirely willing to sacrifice my life, my happiness, and my future just to keep Emily completely comfortable. They wanted me to betray my grandmother, the only person who actually cared if I lived or died, just so Todd could close another greedy commercial deal. I slowly reached out and picked up the piece of paper. Susan let out a massive, heavy sigh of profound relief, clearly believing her toxic manipulation had worked perfectly once again. "Oh, thank goodness, Sarah," she said, stepping forward to gently touch my arm, playing the role of the loving mother. "I knew you would do the right thing. I knew you would protect your sister and our family reputation. We are family, honey. We always take care of each other when things get difficult." I looked down at her soft, perfectly manicured hand, resting lightly on my cheap frayed denim sleeve. I thought about the massive luxury SUV sitting pristine and clean in her driveway. I thought about the fraudulent premium credit cards bearing my exact legal name, hiding safely in my father's mahogany desk. I thought about the thousands of exhausting hours I had spent standing on my aching, swollen feet, serving pie to strangers in the middle of the night just to keep my electricity from being shut off. I looked Susan dead in the eyes, and I folded the legal document perfectly in half. Then I folded it in half again. I tossed the crumpled, expensive paper directly into my small plastic trash can. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice dropping to a completely quiet, absolute zero. "And I am absolutely not calling Clara. You do not get to come into my home, the freezing home you deliberately forced me into, and demand that I help you steal the rest of her money." Richard let out a sudden roar of absolute pure fury. He lunged forward aggressively, grabbing me roughly by both of my shoulders. "You! Listen to me, you pathetic little failure!" He shouted, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling strongly of stale coffee and pure, unadulterated panic. "You are going to fix this problem right now, or I swear I will make sure you never get a single step ahead in this city. I will completely ruin you. I will make sure you lose your jobs and your apartment." I did not flinch. I did not pull away from his harsh, painful grip. I stared straight back into his furious, bloodshot eyes, and I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying, completely empty smile that visibly unsettled him. His aggressive grip on my shoulders slightly loosened as he realized he was no longer looking at the scared, submissive, beaten-down daughter he had bullied for 26 years. "You cannot ruin me, Dad," I whispered, staring directly into his dark soul. "You already took absolutely everything I had. You took my graduation money. You took my credit score. You took my entire youth and my peace of mind. There is absolutely nothing left for you to take from me. But I promise you, right here and right now, I am going to take absolutely everything from you." I stepped back violently, breaking his physical hold on my shoulders. I raised my hand and pointed a steady, unwavering finger directly at my open apartment door, leading out into the dark hallway. "Get out of my house," I commanded, my voice echoing loudly and sharply off the bare, peeling walls. "Get out of my house right now, before I call the police and tell them exactly how you opened 6 fraudulent premium credit cards, using my social security number to fund your lavish, pathetic life." The color entirely violently vanished from Richard's face. The threat hit him like a massive physical blow, directly to the stomach. Susan gasped loudly, covering her mouth with both hands, her eyes blown completely wide with absolute sheer terror. They thought the $80,000 was the only secret I had discovered. Hearing me explicitly name the severe credit card fraud completely shattered their entire arrogant defensive strategy. Their fake power evaporated instantly in the cold air. "How did you?" Susan stammered completely, unable to form a single coherent sentence, her hands shaking wildly against her face. "I said, 'Get out!' I yelled, my voice finally breaking through the quiet control shattering the silence of the apartment building. They scrambled backward, stumbling over each other in a desperate, frantic panic to get out the door and into the dim safety of the hallway. Richard did not say another word. The arrogant, domineering bully had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, desperate man who suddenly realized he was standing directly on the tracks of a massive oncoming train. Susan was actually sobbing, quiet, terrified tears, as she pulled her cashmere sweater tightly around her shaking body. I slammed the heavy door shut as hard as I could, throwing the metal deadbolt and loudly locking the chain into place. I leaned heavily against the cold wood, listening to their frantic, uneven footsteps echoing rapidly down the concrete stairwell. My entire body was vibrating violently with pure, blinding adrenaline and a deep, profound sense of power I had never felt before in my entire life. I reached into my pocket with a shaking hand and pulled out my phone, dialing David's direct legal line. He answered on the very first ring, his voice crisp and professional. "They just tried to force me to sign over Clara's assets," I told him, my voice shaking but fiercely determined. "And they explicitly threatened to completely destroy my life if I did not help them cover up the bank freeze." David let out a low, dark chuckle on the other end of the line. "Excellent," he replied, his voice full of sharp, dangerous legal confidence. "Let them panic, Sarah. Let them scramble blindly in the dark." The Federal Criminal Division received the entire forensic file this morning. By the time they figure out what is actually happening to their precious fake empire, they will already be entirely, permanently buried. The crisp morning light filtered through the large, sterile windows of the Oak Haven Rehabilitation Center. It was a high-end facility featuring polished hardwood floors and the faint smell of lavender bleach deliberately meant to mask the reality of illness and age. I sat in a stiff vinyl chair in the corner of my grandmother Clara's private room, watching the digital clock on the wall slowly tick forward. My hands were folded tightly in my lap, and my heart pounded a heavy, relentless rhythm against my ribs. We knew they were coming. Desperation makes arrogant people incredibly predictable. David, our sharp, incredibly meticulous attorney, stood quietly by the window reviewing a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. Next to him sat a state-certified notary named Helen, who had arrived exactly 30 minutes prior with her official stamps and seals perfectly arranged on a small rolling tray table. Clara sat upright in her adjustable hospital bed. She did not look like a frail, elderly woman recovering from a stroke. Her posture was completely rigid, and her eyes burned with a fierce, intense clarity. She looked like a reigning monarch, actively preparing to completely annihilate a treasonous rebellion. We had spent the entire morning executing a flawless, legally bulletproof strategy. David had carefully drafted a brand new, comprehensive estate plan for Clara. For my entire life, my father Richard had been legally designated as Clara's primary beneficiary and the sole executor of her estate. He held her conditional power of attorney, which meant that if she ever became incapacitated, he would instantly gain complete, absolute control over her entire financial portfolio and all of her medical decisions. Richard and my mother Susan had banked their entire fraudulent empire on that exact legal safety net. But as the morning sun illuminated the sterile hospital room, Clara picked up a heavy black pen. With a steady, unwavering hand, she signed her name on the dotted line of a brand new document. Helen the notary stepped forward, sliding her official seal across the bottom of the page, pressing down with a loud, satisfying clack. It was done. In that single quiet moment, Clara completely and permanently stripped Richard of every single legal right he possessed regarding her life and her wealth. She transferred full medical and financial power of attorney directly to me. She legally named me as the sole executor of her estate. Furthermore, David had drafted a specific punitive clause, absolutely disinheriting Richard, Susan, and my sister Emily from receiving a single dime of her remaining fortune. The legal cage was completely locked. Now, we simply had to wait for the rats to walk blindly into it. We did not have to wait long. The heavy wooden door to Clara's private room suddenly burst open completely, ignoring the standard protocol of knocking. My parents marched into the room, walking with an aggressive, entitled energy that sucked the air straight out of the space. My father, Richard, led the charge, his jaw set in a hard, aggressive line. My mother, Susan, followed closely behind him, wearing a perfectly tailored designer coat and carrying a thick leather briefcase. Trailing right behind them was a fast-talking, slick-suited attorney I had never seen before. He wore an expensive gray suit and carried himself with the slimy, confident swagger of a man who made his living bullying the vulnerable. They had brought their own legal muscle. Their absolute sheer audacity was physically nauseating. They were completely banking on the fact that Clara was weak, exhausted, and mentally compromised from her stroke. They needed to bypass the sudden, massive bank freeze that Robert the forensic accountant had triggered the day prior. Their fraudulent shell corporation was bleeding money, and Todd desperately needed cash to save his failing commercial real estate deal. Since I had aggressively refused to help them, they had decided to take the absolute nuclear option. They were here to legally declare Clara mentally incapacitated so they could forcefully seize her entire retirement portfolio before she even knew what was happening. Because I was sitting silently in the shadowed corner of the large room, and David was standing quietly behind the privacy curtain near the window, my parents did not see us at first. They only saw Clara sitting in her bed. Susan immediately turned on her terrifyingly fake maternal charm. She rushed forward toward the hospital bed, her face twisting into a deeply exaggerated mask of profound sorrow and desperate concern. "Oh, Mom," Susan cried out, her voice dripping with calculated, sugary sweetness. "We have been so incredibly worried about you. You look so tired. You look so terribly confused and exhausted. We came as quickly as we possibly could." Richard stepped up to the opposite side of the bed, completely crowding Clara's physical space in a blatant attempt to aggressively intimidate her. He placed his large, heavy hands firmly on the bedside railing, leaning over her with a patronizing, deeply insulting smile. "Mom, you have not been answering your phone," Richard said, using a slow, loud voice as if he were actively speaking to a confused toddler. "We know the stroke has really messed with your memory. We know you are having a very hard time distinguishing reality from fiction right now. The doctors told us this kind of severe cognitive decline is completely normal at your age. You do not need to worry about anything anymore. We are here to take the heavy burden completely off your shoulders." I sat frozen in my chair, feeling a hot, blinding fury flood my entire nervous system. The psychological manipulation was absolutely staggering. They were actively, maliciously attempting to gaslight a perfectly sane 78-year-old woman into believing her own brain was decaying. They were trying to convince her she was losing her mind just so they could comfortably steal the money she had worked her entire life to save. The slick attorney stepped forward, popping open the golden clasps of Susan's leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of dense, heavily worded legal documents and laid them aggressively across Clara's lap. "Mrs. Jenkins," the attorney said, flashing a brilliantly fake white smile. "My name is Mr. Sterling. Your loving son and daughter-in-law have retained my services to help protect your assets during this incredibly difficult period of your cognitive decline. We have prepared an emergency conservatorship agreement. By signing these documents today, you will simply allow Richard to manage your complex banking issues so you can just focus entirely on resting your confused mind. It is a very standard procedure for patients suffering from dementia." Susan reached out and attempted to grab Clara's fragile hand. "Just sign the papers, Mom," she coaxed, her voice low and aggressively persistent. "You know you cannot handle these things anymore. You are imagining things that never happened. You are making up stories about $80,000 and graduation gifts because your brain is sick. You need to let Richard take full control right now before you accidentally bankrupt yourself." Clara did not flinch. She did not pull her hand away. She simply looked up at Susan and then slowly turned her gaze to Richard. Her brown eyes were completely, entirely devoid of any warmth. They were the eyes of a woman looking at two complete strangers. "You think I'm losing my mind?" Clara asked, her voice incredibly soft, but carrying a sharp, dangerous edge that echoed clearly through the quiet hospital room. "You think my brain is broken because I finally noticed that you stole your own daughter's future to buy a luxury house for a man who commits federal tax fraud." Richard's face instantly morphed from fake pity to violent, aggressive anger. His entire facade dropped in a single, terrifying second. He slammed his fist down hard on the metal railing of the hospital bed, making a loud, jarring sound that made the slick attorney actually jump backward in surprise. "Listen to me, you crazy old woman." Richard snarled, his voice dropping into a harsh, vicious whisper. "You are going to sign these papers, right this exact second. You are going to sign over the financial control, and you are going to tell the bank to lift the security freeze on our accounts. If you do not sign this conservatorship today, I will go directly to a judge tomorrow and have you legally declared entirely unfit to care for yourself. I will throw you in the cheapest state-run nursing facility I can find, and I will make absolutely sure you rot there. Now pick up the pen and sign the damn paper." The absolute sheer evil of his threat hung heavily in the sterile air. He was completely willing to destroy his own mother's life. throw her into a miserable state facility, and strip away her basic human dignity just to protect the money he had stolen from me. I could not sit in the shadows for a single second longer. I stood up from the vinyl chair. The sudden movement caught Richard's attention. He whipped his head around, his eyes widening in absolute sheer shock as he finally noticed me standing in the corner of the room. Susan actually gasped, taking a massive stumbling step backward, bumping directly into her expensive, sleazy attorney. Sarah Susan stammered, her voice trembling wildly as her eyes darted between me and Clara. "What exactly are you doing here? You are not supposed to be here." I walked slowly and deliberately across the polished floor, placing myself directly between Richard and my grandmother's hospital bed. I looked up at the man who had thrown me out onto a dark, freezing porch with nothing but garbage bags when I was just 13 years old. I looked at the man who had secretly opened premium credit cards in my name, completely destroying my financial security, while publicly lecturing me about the supreme value of hard work. "I am exactly where I belong," I said, my voice completely steady and perfectly calm. "I am protecting my family, something you clearly know absolutely nothing about." Richard let out a loud, arrogant scoff, aggressively waving his hand in my face. "You cannot protect anyone, Sarah," he sneered, his face flushing with dark red anger. "You are a broke, pathetic waitress who cannot even afford a working transmission. You have absolutely no power here. Step aside right now before I have you physically removed from this medical facility for interfering with family business." "Actually, Richard, that will not be happening today." The deep, authoritative voice came from the other side of the room. David stepped out from behind the privacy curtain, holding his sleek leather portfolio. He walked forward with the immense, intimidating presence of a senior partner who absolutely loved utterly destroying arrogant criminals in court. Helen the notary stood up quietly behind him, adjusting her official glasses. Richard and Susan stared at David, their mouths hanging completely open in profound confusion. The slick attorney they had brought with them suddenly looked incredibly nervous. He instinctively took another step backward, clearly recognizing the aggressive, high-stakes energy David was radiating. "Who the hell are you?" Richard demanded, his voice slightly higher and much less confident than it had been a moment ago. "My name is David Hastings," David replied smoothly, coming to stand directly beside me. "I am the senior estate and financial attorney for Mrs. Clara Jenkins, and I highly advise you to immediately remove those fraudulent, unverified conservatorship documents from my client's bed before I have you arrested for attempted coercion and elder abuse." Susan let out a shrill, panicked noise, grabbing Richard's arm frantically. "Richard," she whispered, her voice laced with pure, absolute terror. "Richard, what is going on?" Their sleazy lawyer finally found his voice, attempting to sound professional, but failing completely. "Now see here, Mr. Hastings," he stammered nervously, holding up his hands. "We are simply trying to execute a standard medical conservatorship for a woman who is clearly suffering from severe cognitive decline. Richard is her son and her primary legal beneficiary. He has every right to step in and manage her complex affairs." David offered a sharp, predatory smile that did absolutely nothing to warm his cold, calculating eyes. He opened his leather portfolio and pulled out the freshly stamped, legally binding documents Clara had signed just 10 minutes prior. "That is where you are completely, entirely wrong," David said, his voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable authority. "As of 8:30 this morning, Richard Jenkins has absolutely no legal rights, no legal standing, and no authority regarding this woman or her estate." David dropped the heavy stack of documents directly on top of the fraudulent papers Richard had placed on Clara's lap. "Mrs. Jenkins has just completed a comprehensive, completely verified psychiatric evaluation by the chief neurologist of this facility." David continued, staring directly into Richard's terrified eyes. "She has been certified as possessing full, absolute mental capacity, and using that capacity, she has officially legally transferred her total medical and financial power of attorney. She has completely designated a new executor for her estate, and she has signed a permanent, irrevocable clause entirely stripping Richard, Susan, and Emily Jenkins of any future inheritance." The color completely, violently vanished from Susan's face. She looked like she was going to physically vomit right there on the polished hardwood floor. Richard stared at the legal documents as if they were actively burning him. His mouth opened and closed, but no words managed to escape his throat. "Who David the sleazy lawyer?" asked, his voice now shaking with obvious professional panic. "Who holds the power of attorney?" David turned his head slightly, gesturing perfectly toward me. "Sarah Jenkins." David announced the name, dropping like a heavy iron anvil in the center of the quiet hospital room. Sarah holds the keys to everything. She controls the medical directives, she controls the financial portfolio, and she controls the official response to the severe federal tax fraud your clients recently committed using a fake shell corporation registered in Susan's maiden name. The silence that followed was absolute and incredibly beautiful. It was the profound, deafening silence of a fake, arrogant empire completely collapsing into dust. Susan let out a loud, dramatic sob, covering her face with her shaking hands. Richard stumbled backward, hitting the wall of the hospital room, sliding down slightly as his knees physically gave out under the crushing, immense weight of his total defeat. Their sleazy attorney did not even bother to console them. He grabbed his expensive briefcase, turned completely around, and sprinted out the heavy wooden door without saying a single word, completely abandoning his clients to their fate. Clara sat up straight in her hospital bed, adjusting her blankets with a calm, steady grace. She looked down at Richard, her own son cowering miserably against the sterile wall. "You told my granddaughter that struggling builds character," Clara said, her voice echoing with a cold, absolute finality. "You told her she needed to figure out how to survive on her own. You stole her graduation money, and you completely ruined her credit score so you could buy luxury cars and expensive country club dinners." Clara pointed a trembling but deeply fierce finger directly at the open doorway. "Well, Richard," Clara continued, her eyes burning with pure, justified vengeance. "The bank freeze is completely permanent. The IRS Criminal Division already has the official forensic accounting files. You are going to lose the luxury house you bought for Emily. You are going to lose the fancy cars. You are going to lose absolutely everything. Now get out of my room and go build some character." 2 weeks had passed since the explosive confrontation at the rehabilitation center. 2 weeks since my grandmother Clara had completely stripped my father of his legal power and handed the reins of her life and her finances over to me. In a rational world, my parents would have immediately gone into hiding. They would have canceled their social events, hired criminal defense attorneys, and braced themselves for the inevitable consequences of stealing $80,000 and committing identity fraud. But Richard and Susan Jenkins did not live in a rational world. They lived in a carefully constructed bubble of suburban delusion where appearances mattered more than federal law. They truly believed that because we had not yet dragged them into a courtroom, they had somehow successfully intimidated us into silence. They thought my grandmother was too embarrassed by her own family to make a public scene. They thought I was still just the exhausted, broke waitress who would never dare to challenge them in front of their highly respected peers. Because of this absolute blinding arrogance, they decided to proceed exactly as planned with their massive 30th wedding anniversary celebration. The event was held on a crisp Saturday evening at the sprawling community hall of their local church. This was not a modest gathering in a small basement. My parents had rented out the grand hall, a massive room with vaulted ceilings, polished oak floors, and towering stained glass windows. It was the exact kind of venue that screamed upper-middle-class respectability. They had hired a professional catering company, draped the tables in crisp white linen, and hired a jazz trio to play softly in the corner. It was a perfect picture of American suburban success, built entirely on a foundation of stolen money and shattered credit. Clara and I were not officially invited. After my father had threatened to throw her into a state-run nursing home, and I had kicked them out of her hospital room, our invitations had been permanently revoked. But we did not need an invitation. This was a community church hall, and the doors were wide open to the congregation. I drove Clara to the church in my sputtering 10-year-old sedan. The parking lot was absolutely packed with luxury vehicles. I saw gleaming sedans, pristine sports utility vehicles, and imported sports cars. These belonged to my parents, wealthy friends, the church elders, and most importantly, the high-level corporate partners from Todd's financial brokerage firm. Todd had clearly used this anniversary party as a networking opportunity to show his wealthy investors what a stable, respectable family he married into. I parked my rusted car near the back of the lot near the dumpsters. I walked around to the passenger side and gently helped Clara out of the vehicle. She leaned heavily on her wooden cane, but her posture was impeccably straight. She wore a tailored black dress, and her silver hair was perfectly styled. She looked like a woman marching to war. I wore a simple dark blue dress I had purchased on clearance years ago. It was modest and clean, the absolute best I could manage on a waitress salary. I held a thick, heavy manila folder tightly against my chest. We entered the grand hall through the heavy oak double doors at the back of the room. The space was completely packed with well-dressed guests. The scent of roasted prime rib and expensive floral perfumes hung thick and heavy in the warm air. The soft murmur of polite conversation and the clinking of crystal wine glasses created a suffocating atmosphere of fake joy and hollow prestige. Clara and I did not announce our presence. We simply found a small, empty table near the back wall, in the shadows cast by the balcony overhang. We sat down quietly and watched the sickening performance unfold. From my vantage point, I had a perfectly clear view of the entire room. My mother, Susan, was holding court near the center of the hall. She was wearing an incredibly extravagant emerald green silk dress that draped perfectly over her shoulders. Around her neck hung a thick string of cultured pearls. I stared at that necklace and felt a sharp, vicious ache in my stomach. I knew exactly how she had paid for it. I had seen the exact transaction line on the fraudulent platinum credit card statement hidden in my father's mahogany desk. She was literally standing in the house of God, accepting compliments from her church friends while wearing stolen property that was actively ruining my financial future. My father, Richard, was standing near the catered buffet station, laughing loudly and clapping other men on the shoulder. He wore a brand new tailored charcoal suit. He looked the part of the proud, generous patriarch. He was pouring expensive wine for the senior pastor and talking about the absolute importance of community and family values. It took every single ounce of my self-control not to march across the room and scream. I thought about the hundreds of nights I had spent coming home at 2 a.m, smelling of stale diner grease and fryer oil, my feet swollen and blistered because I could not afford proper supportive shoes. I thought about eating plain instant rice for 5 days straight so I could make the minimum payment on my student loans. And here was my father drinking $40 wine and pretending he was a saint. Across the room, my sister Emily and her husband Todd were successfully working the crowd of financial investors. Emily looked immaculate in a designer cocktail dress, her blonde hair cascading perfectly down her back. She was laughing delicately at a joke made by one of Todd's senior partners. Todd stood beside her, projecting the absolute image of a self-made titan. He held his expensive scotch glass and gestured widely with his free hand, clearly boasting about his recent market victories. He was completely in his element, selling his fake reality to men who trusted him with their life savings. The absolute hypocrisy of the room was physically suffocating. It felt like the air was being slowly drained out of my lungs. I looked at the hundreds of smiling faces, the pastor, the neighbors, the investors. Every single person in this grand hall genuinely believed they were celebrating a family built on hard work, dedication, and moral integrity. None of them knew that the food they were eating, the clothes my parents were wearing, and the wealth Todd was bragging about were entirely funded by destroying the life of the youngest daughter, who was currently sitting in the shadows. Clara reached across the table and placed her warm hand over my trembling fingers. Her touch was steady and grounding. We watched together as the jazz trio finished their set and the room began to quiet down. The catering staff moved swiftly around the tables, clearing the dinner plates and pouring fresh champagne for the toasts. The main event was about to begin. Pastor Miller, a tall man with a booming, welcoming voice, stepped up to the wooden podium at the front of the hall. He tapped the microphone and smiled warmly at the gathered crowd, friends and family. Pastor Miller began, his voice echoing clearly through the vaulted room. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate a truly remarkable milestone. 30 years of holy matrimony. 30 years of deep, unwavering commitment. Richard and Susan Jenkins have been pillars of this community for decades. They have shown us all what it means to build a home founded on love, honesty, and absolute sacrifice. A round of warm, polite applause rippled through the room. I felt my jaw clench so tightly, my teeth ached. Honesty and sacrifice. The words felt like physical poison in the air. Pastor Miller continued his praise. They have raised 2 beautiful daughters. They have supported their family through thick and thin, and they have always put the needs of their children before their own comforts. Tonight, we celebrate not just a marriage, but a legacy of family devotion. I would like to invite Richard to the stage to say a few words. The applause grew louder as my father stepped up to the podium. He shook the pastor's hand warmly and adjusted the microphone. He looked out over the sea of smiling faces, his chest puffed out with absolute immense pride. He did not look toward the back of the room. He had no idea we were sitting in the darkness. "Thank you, Pastor Richard," said his voice thick with fake emotion. "And thank you to everyone who came out tonight to celebrate with us. 30 years is a long time. Susan and I have built a wonderful life together, but it was not always easy. We faced our struggles. We had our tight financial years just like anyone else, but we always remembered our core values. We always knew that family comes first." I gripped the manila folder in my lap, my fingernails digging deeply into the thick paper. He was actually standing in front of a church congregation, rewriting history to make himself the hero. We learned early on that true love requires making hard choices. Richard continued looking directly at Emily and Todd, who were sitting at the front table. As parents, our greatest joy is seeing our children succeed. We poured everything we had into providing a strong, stable foundation for our family. We made the tough financial sacrifices so that the next generation could thrive. And looking at my beautiful daughter Emily and her wonderful, successful husband Todd, I know that every single late night and every single sacrifice was absolutely worth it. We wanted to give them the world, and seeing the incredible life they are building brings tears to my eyes. The crowd let out a collective, sympathetic "aw." Several women at the tables near the front dabbed their eyes with napkins. Richard raised his champagne glass high into the air. To Susan, my beautiful wife, Richard projected, and to the unbreakable bond of family. May we never take our blessings for granted. The room erupted into cheers and applause. Glasses clinked and people murmured their heartfelt agreements. Richard smiled broadly and stepped back from the microphone, gesturing for Emily to take the stage. Emily stood up, smoothing her designer dress, and walked gracefully to the podium. She carried a small folded piece of paper, but she did not look at it. She looked directly at her parents, her eyes already swimming with perfectly timed performative tears. She took a deep breath, playing the role of the deeply moved perfect daughter. Mom and Dad Emily started, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "I just want to say thank you. You have given me absolutely everything. When Todd and I were looking to buy our first house, we were so stressed about the market. But you stepped in without hesitation. You gave us the massive support we needed to build our dream life. You always taught me that family is the most important investment anyone can make." She paused, wiping a single tear from her cheek. "You shielded me from the struggles of the world. You gave me the absolute best foundation any daughter could ever ask for. I love you both so much. Thank you for being the most honest, generous parents in the entire world." The crowd applauded even louder this time. Susan stood up from her chair and walked over to hug Emily tightly, while the guests watched in pure admiration. Todd raised his glass toward Richard, signaling his deep respect. It was a flawless, beautiful display of absolute total garbage. The suffocating atmosphere in the room had reached its absolute breaking point. The sheer weight of their collective lies was actively crushing the oxygen out of the air. I looked at Clara. She gave me a single, firm nod. The time for waiting in the shadows was completely over. I stood up from the small table at the back of the hall. My legs felt slightly unsteady for just a fraction of a second before a cold, hard rush of pure adrenaline locked my knees into place. I gripped the heavy manila folder in my right hand. Inside that folder was the official bank record of the $80,000 wire transfer. Inside that folder were the printed photographs of the fraudulent shell company tax returns. Inside that folder were the active credit card statements proving they had stolen my identity. And every single document had been officially notarized and stamped with the bright red seal of the county court, making them undeniable legally binding evidence. I stepped out from the shadows of the balcony overhang and began to walk straight down the long center aisle of the church hall. My heels clicked softly against the polished oak floor. At first, no one noticed me. The crowd was still clapping and smiling at the emotional embrace between Emily and Susan, but as I moved further down the aisle into the bright overhead lights, the people sitting at the back tables began to turn their heads. The soft murmurs of conversation slowly began to falter and die out. A ripple of confusion quickly spread through the room as guests noticed a young woman in a simple, cheap dress walking aggressively toward the stage holding a thick legal file. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the podium. I did not look at the pastor. I did not look at Todd's wealthy investors. I just kept walking my pace steady and completely unrelenting. The silence in the room spread like a physical wave rolling from the back of the hall all the way to the front. The applause completely stopped. The jazz trio, sensing the sudden dramatic shift in the room, abruptly stopped playing their instruments. By the time I reached the front row, the entire grand hall was completely, absolutely silent. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit running in the ceiling. Richard turned around from hugging Emily. The confident, proud smile on his face froze completely solid the exact second his eyes locked onto mine. Susan pulled away from Emily and gasped, her hand flying to her throat as the color violently drained from her cheeks. Emily stared at me in pure shock, her fake tears instantly drying up. Todd practically dropped his champagne glass onto the table, his arrogant posture immediately turning into a rigid, defensive stance. I did not stop at the front table. I walked up the 3 wooden steps onto the main stage. I walked directly past my terrified father and my horrified mother. I stepped right up to the wooden podium and adjusted the microphone slightly so it perfectly met my height. I placed the thick, heavy stack of financial documents squarely on the podium, right next to Emily's discarded speech notes. The bright red court seals on the pages gleamed under the stage lights, perfectly visible to the front rows. I looked out at the massive sea of confused, silent faces, and I took a deep, steady breath. The aftermath of the church hall confrontation was incredibly swift and absolutely brutal. I did not stay to watch my parents try to explain the court-stamped financial documents to their wealthy friends or their bewildered pastor. Clara and I simply walked out of the grand hall, leaving the undeniable truth sitting heavily on the wooden podium. We had lit the match, and now the fire was spreading rapidly through their perfectly constructed fake lives. For 26 years, I had been conditioned to believe that family meant quietly absorbing pain so others could comfortably shine. I had served cherry pie at 2 a.m, scrubbing sticky diner tables while my sister picked out imported marble countertops with my stolen future. But the universe has a very strict accounting system, and the bill had finally come due. The very next morning, David, our real estate attorney, and Robert, our forensic accountant, unleashed the full legal arsenal. The evidence I had gathered from my father's mahogany desk was more than enough to trigger a massive federal inquiry. Todd had built his entire arrogant identity around being a financial genius. He loved to boast loudly about his aggressive market strategies and his brilliant leverage techniques to anyone who would listen. But there is absolutely nothing brilliant about federal tax evasion. The Internal Revenue Service does not care about country club memberships or suburban prestige. They care exclusively about paper trails, and Todd had left a massive, undeniably criminal one. By funneling my grandmother's $80,000 through a fake shell corporation, registered in my mother's maiden name, Todd had committed severe financial fraud. He had officially classified the stolen funds as a short-term business loan to bypass the gift tax, completely violating federal banking regulations. When the federal investigators officially froze his accounts, the dominoes began to fall with terrifying speed. Todd's elite brokerage firm, the one he constantly bragged about, conducted their own immediate internal audit. Financial institutions rely entirely on trust and strict regulatory compliance. The absolute second the senior partners discovered Todd was actively under federal investigation for tax evasion and elder financial abuse, they completely severed ties. I was sitting in my small kitchen pouring a cup of cheap tap water when David called to tell me the phenomenal news. Todd had not just been fired from his lucrative position. His professional financial advisory license had been permanently revoked by the state board. The man who had stood behind a stainless steel grill in a $1 million backyard, arrogantly lecturing me about financial literacy, was now completely legally barred from ever working in the finance industry again. His wealthy investors, the same men who had been drinking his expensive scotch at the barbecue, panicked and immediately pulled their massive portfolios. Todd's entire career evaporated into thin air in less than 14 days. Without Todd's massive income, the fake empire he and Emily had built immediately began to collapse under its own heavy, unsustainable weight. The sprawling 5-bedroom house in the affluent northern suburbs, the house that was heavily financed by my stolen graduation gift and my ruined credit score, became a massive financial anchor, dragging them straight down to the bottom. They had been living so far beyond their actual means, relying on stolen capital to float their extravagant lifestyle, that they had absolutely zero safety net to fall back on. When the bank accounts were permanently frozen, they missed their very first mortgage payment. Then they missed the second. I drove past their neighborhood one overcast Tuesday afternoon. I parked my sputtering 10-year-old sedan down the street and watched with quiet satisfaction as a sleek white tow truck backed into their pristine driveway. The shiny new luxury SUV, the one Todd had proudly displayed at the family barbecue, was hitched up and unceremoniously repossessed. Emily was standing on the wraparound porch, wearing expensive designer sweatpants and crying hysterically as she watched her ultimate status symbol being towed away down the street. The bank moved forward with aggressive foreclosure proceedings shortly after. Emily and Todd had to pack their designer clothes into cheap cardboard boxes and vacate the property before the bank officially seized it. The custom kitchen, the imported white orchids, the expensive interior decorations, they were all entirely gone. Emily had always played the perfect golden daughter, basking in the warm glow of my parents' relentless favoritism. She had happily turned a blind eye to my daily suffering, accepting a luxury house while perfectly knowing I was freezing in a run-down apartment. Now, she was experiencing the exact terrifying instability she had completely ignored in my life. She had to move into a tiny, cramped, rented apartment on the unfashionable side of town, a reality that absolutely shattered her fragile suburban identity. But the absolute most desperate part of the collapse came from my parents. Richard and Susan had tied their own financial security directly to Todd's fraudulent shell corporation by acting as the willing guarantors for his bridge loans and allowing my mother's maiden name to be used for the illegal transfers. They had completely implicated themselves in the federal fraud. Their own personal bank accounts remained entirely frozen. The premium platinum credit cards they had maliciously opened using my social security number had been permanently shut down and flagged for severe identity theft. The comfortable, lavish retirement they had planned using my grandmother's stolen money was entirely destroyed. They were bleeding cash, and they had nowhere left to turn. The desperation finally broke them on a rainy Friday evening. I had just returned to my apartment after finishing a long, exhausting shift at the medical billing office. I was taking off my worn-out work boots when my cell phone began to vibrate violently on the kitchen counter. I looked down at the caller identification. It was Susan. My mother had not tried to contact me since the night I locked her out of my apartment and threatened to expose her credit card fraud. I stared at the glowing screen, watching her name flash again and again in the dim light of my kitchen. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let it ring into the empty silence and leave her to her misery. But the hardened, empowered part of me, the woman who had finally found her voice, needed to hear exactly what she had to say. I needed to hear the sound of her false empire crashing down. I picked up the phone and pressed the green answer button. I did not say a single word. I simply held the device to my ear and listened to the heavy, frantic breathing on the other end of the line. Sarah Susan said, her voice trembling so violently it was barely recognizable. Sarah, please, please do not hang up the phone on me. You have to talk to me. I leaned against the cheap composite wood of my kitchen counter, keeping my expression completely blank and my posture perfectly relaxed. I am listening, I said, my voice cool and entirely detached from any familial warmth. Susan let out a loud, ragged sob that echoed sharply through the phone speaker. The arrogant, wealthy matriarch who had constantly belittled my cheap clothes and my exhausting jobs was completely gone. She sounded like a terrified, broken woman grasping blindly in the dark. Sarah, you have to stop this, she begged, her words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate rush. You have to call your attorney and drop the civil lawsuit over the $80,000. You have to tell the federal investigators that this was all just a massive family misunderstanding. We can tell them it was a simple accounting error. I stared at the peeling paint on my kitchen wall, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, profound clarity. A misunderstanding, I repeated flatly, letting the sheer absurdity of her request hang heavily in the air between us. Yes, Susan cried, her voice reaching a high-pitched tone of pure rising panic. Todd is facing actual federal prison time, Sarah. Emily is completely devastated, and she cries every single day. They lost the beautiful house. They lost the cars. Your father and I have absolutely no access to our savings because the bank will not lift the freeze. We cannot even buy basic groceries without borrowing cash from the church congregation. You have made your point, Sarah. You have proven how strong and resourceful you are. We are so incredibly sorry for everything, but you have to stop this legal assault now, before our entire family is permanently ruined forever. I listened to her desperate pleading pleas, marveling at the sheer persistent delusion of her words. Even now, standing in the absolute wreckage of her own malicious actions, she was still actively trying to manipulate the narrative. She was still trying to make me responsible for their survival. She offered no genuine apology for the pain she caused me, only panic over the consequences she was finally facing. Sarah, please, Susan sobbed heavily, her breath catching in her throat. We are your parents. Emily is your sister. We share the exact same blood. Blood ties mean something in this world, Sarah. You cannot do this to your own family. I am begging you as your mother. Find it in your heart to forgive us and drop the civil lawsuit. We can go back to being a family. We can fix this and start over. The silence stretched over the phone line, thick and heavy as lead. I thought about the 4 years I spent hand-copying library textbooks because I could not afford to buy the required materials. I thought about standing in the freezing snow, waiting for a city bus because my parents refused to co-sign a modest loan for a safe car, while simultaneously stealing my identity to buy expensive tropical vacations. I thought about Clara sitting in that miserable hospital bed, watching her own son try to strip away her basic human dignity just to steal her retirement fund. They did not want my forgiveness. They simply wanted to escape the brutal, heavy consequences of their own calculated cruelty. They wanted me to roll over and play the submissive spare child one last time so they could comfortably return to their shallow, wealthy facade. They wanted the girl who never asked questions back. But that girl was dead. Mom, I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady tone that carried the absolute, undeniable weight of 26 years of suffering. Yes, Sarah, Susan gasped, hopefully eagerly anticipating my capitulation. Yes, honey, I am here. I took a deep, slow breath, feeling the final lingering threads of my childhood guilt completely snap and dissolve entirely into thin air. Families do not steal money from each other, I said, speaking slowly and deliberately, so every single word hit like a physical strike. Families do not steal their daughter's social security number to open fraudulent credit cards and ruin her financial future. Families do not drain an ailing grandmother's life savings to buy luxury cars for a golden child. And families absolutely do not abandon their children to work grueling night shifts while throwing extravagant country club parties with stolen money. But Sarah, we were just trying to... Susan tried to interrupt, her voice frantic and laced with rising hysteria. I did not let her finish. You chose your path 4 years ago when you stole my future to fund Emily's perfect life. I continued, my voice rising with cold, unwavering authority. You chose your path when you called me a sick, ungrateful burden in my own freezing apartment. You are not my family, Susan. You are simply the people who happened to raise me. The civil lawsuit proceeds exactly as filed. The federal investigators will receive every single piece of evidence my lawyer has gathered. You built a fake empire on lies and theft, and now you are going to watch it burn entirely to the ground. Do not ever call this number again. I pulled the phone away from my ear, ignoring her desperate screaming pleas, and pressed the red button. The call disconnected, plunging my small apartment back into a deep, beautiful silence. I set the phone down on the counter and walked over to the window, looking out at the dark city skyline. The suffocating atmosphere that had completely dominated my entire life was finally lifted. I took a deep breath of clean, fresh air, feeling the absolute satisfying weight of true, undeniable justice. The legal battle did not drag on for years because David and Robert had built an absolutely impenetrable wall of hard forensic evidence. When we finally stood in the county courtroom, the judge did not show even a single ounce of leniency toward my parents. The court officially ruled that Richard and Susan Jenkins had maliciously stolen my $80,000 graduation gift, but the judge did not stop there. Because they had actively committed severe identity theft by opening 6 premium credit cards in my name, the court awarded me massive punitive damages. They were legally ordered to completely repay the original $80,000 plus 4 entire years of compounding interest and an additional $50,000 in direct compensation for the calculated credit fraud that had completely destroyed my early 20s. Sitting in that quiet courtroom, listening to the judge read the final binding verdict, felt like taking a full deep breath of fresh oxygen for the very first time in my entire adult life. I looked across the wooden aisle at the 2 people who had brought me into this world. They sat completely slumped in their hard wooden chairs, looking utterly defeated and entirely broken. They had spent my entire youth telling me that I was a burden and a bad investment. They had actively forced me to freeze in a dangerous run-down apartment while they drank imported wine and bragged about family values. Now, the highest legal authority in the county was forcing them to hand over every single dime they had left just to keep themselves out of federal prison. The transfer of funds cleared my new secure bank account exactly 3 weeks after the final court ruling. I sat at my cheap kitchen table in my miserable apartment and opened my laptop. My hands were physically shaking as I logged into my student loan portal. For 4 grueling years, those loans had hung around my neck like a heavy iron chain, slowly drowning me while I worked miserable double shifts at the diner just to make the bare minimum payments. I typed in the exact payoff amount, using the recovered theft money, and pressed submit. The massive 6-figure debt balance instantly dropped to 0. I closed my laptop and cried quiet, heavy tears of pure, absolute relief. With my financial slate completely wiped clean and my credit score legally restored by the court order, I took the remaining settlement money and began looking for a real home. I did not want a massive luxury estate in the affluent northern suburbs. I did not want imported marble countertops or expensive crystal chandeliers. I simply wanted a safe, warm place where Clara and I could finally live in absolute peace. I found a beautiful little single-story house on a quiet tree-lined street in a safe, modest neighborhood. It had a wide wraparound front porch, painted a soft, cheerful yellow, and a spacious backyard with rich, dark soil perfect for planting a massive vegetable garden. The house was structurally solid and incredibly cozy, featuring large bay windows that let in massive amounts of warm, natural sunlight throughout the entire day. It was absolutely perfect for a 78-year-old stroke survivor who just wanted to spend her remaining years surrounded by quiet nature and genuine love. Moving Clara into our new home was the proudest moment of my entire life. She walked through the front door, leaning lightly on her wooden cane, and her brown eyes immediately filled with bright, happy tears. We set up her bedroom on the ground floor, painting the walls a soft, calming blue and placing her favorite comfortable reading chair right next to the large window overlooking the backyard. We spent the entire first weekend unpacking her old books and arranging her collection of vintage teacups in the wooden glass cabinets in our bright new kitchen. There was no more freezing air blowing through cardboard-taped windows. There was no more stress about the electricity bill being randomly shut off. We were finally entirely safe. Meanwhile, the universe was actively delivering a brutal, crushing dose of absolute justice to the people who had tried to destroy us. The Internal Revenue Service did not care about my parents' desperate emotional pleas or their long-standing country club reputation. Because Todd and my father had aggressively used a fake shell corporation to illegally funnel money and bypass federal gift taxes, the government stepped in and seized whatever assets the civil court had not already ordered them to pay me. The majestic 5-bedroom house Emily and Todd had bragged about was completely foreclosed and sold at a public bank auction. Todd permanently lost his financial advisory license and was legally barred from ever working in the banking sector again. With absolutely no incoming salary and massive mounting legal bills, he was forced to take a minimum wage job, working the overnight shift at a local warehouse, just to pay off his severe government penalties. Emily, the golden child who had happily lived in total luxury while I scrubbed dirty tables, had to sell every single piece of her designer clothing just to keep the lights on. My parents faced the exact same brutal reality. They were forced to completely vacate their pristine suburban estate. With their savings entirely wiped out by the restitution payments and the federal tax fines, they had absolutely no choice but to move into a tiny, rundown apartment complex on the far industrial edge of the city. It was incredibly ironic. It was the exact same kind of dangerous, poorly insulated building they had happily allowed me to live in for 4 years. Now Richard was spending his retirement years listening to noisy neighbors through paper-thin walls, and Susan was forced to take the city bus to the discount grocery store because they could no longer afford a single vehicle. They had built a shallow, arrogant empire entirely on stolen money and toxic lies, and now they were spending the rest of their miserable lives buried completely under the heavy rubble of its total collapse. It has been exactly 6 months since the final court ruling changed my life. It is a warm Sunday afternoon, and I am sitting on my bright yellow front porch, completely bathed in the gentle golden sunlight. The neighborhood is incredibly quiet and peaceful. Clara is sitting right next to me in her comfortable rocking chair, holding a warm ceramic mug of chamomile tea. She is smiling softly, watching the bright red tomatoes and the tall green bean plants growing strong and healthy in our beautiful front garden. I take a slow, deep breath of the fresh, clean air. I look down at my hands. They are no longer blistered and cracked from washing dirty diner dishes until 2 in the morning. I am no longer terrified of checking my bank account balance. I am no longer shrinking myself down to make toxic, cruel people feel big and powerful. I am completely and utterly free. We sit together on the porch in perfect, comfortable silence, enjoying the incredible peace that comes from knowing you absolutely fought for your own worth and won. I look at Clara and I realize that family has absolutely nothing to do with shared blood or birth certificates. Family is the people who actively, fiercely choose to protect you when the rest of the world throws you away. Family is the people who show up and fight for you in the dark. I sip my warm tea and smile, letting the quiet, beautiful afternoon wash over me. The long, exhausting war is finally over, and we have completely undeniably won. If you have made it this far into the story today, I really want to ask you a very important question. Have you ever had to draw a hard, permanent boundary with toxic family members who only ever valued you for what they could actively take from you? Have you ever had to completely walk away from the people who were absolutely supposed to love you most just to save your own life? It is the absolute hardest, most painful decision anyone can ever make, but sometimes it is simply the only possible way left for you to truly survive. Please let me know your own personal story in the comments below. Drop a comment telling me exactly where you are watching this video from today and what time it is right now in your city. I love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. If my journey resonated with you, please hit that like button right now. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Thank you so much for being here with me today, and thank you for listening to my truth. Always remember that you absolutely deserve to be fiercely protected and truly valued. Take care of yourself until next time. People always tell you that time heals all wounds. They tell you that as you get older, you need to learn how to let things go and simply forgive the people who hurt you. They say you only get one mother and one father, and that you should cherish them no matter what happens, because family is supposedly the most important thing in the entire world. For 26 years, I believed that exact narrative. I swallowed the toxic poison they fed me every single day because I genuinely thought that was just the bitter, unavoidable taste of family obligation. I accepted the grueling late-night diner shifts. I accepted the freezing, dangerous walk to the city bus stop in the middle of winter. I accepted my patched-up clothes, my worn-out boots, and my completely empty kitchen cupboards. I thought my intense daily suffering was simply the natural order of the universe, and that I was somehow fundamentally flawed and unworthy of the comfort my sister Emily enjoyed. But what I learned standing in that hospital room and sitting in that high-rise downtown law office changed my entire perspective on what family actually means. I realized something profound that I want every single person watching this to truly understand. Family favoritism is not just a simple emotional issue. It is not just about who gets the bigger piece of cake at a childhood birthday party or who gets the most praise at the holiday dinner table. In cases like mine, and perhaps in cases like yours, family favoritism is sometimes the ultimate act of material cruelty. My parents did not just simply prefer my older sister. They did not just happen to relate to her better. They actively, maliciously fed me to the wolves so she could wear a designer coat. They looked at their two daughters and decided without a single ounce of hesitation that one was a golden princess who deserved a luxury estate and a perfect life, and the other was nothing more than a human bank account waiting to be completely drained. They viewed my entire existence as a sacrifice they were perfectly willing to make to ensure their own comfortable, wealthy facade remained entirely intact. When a complete stranger steals your identity, it is a terrible, stressful crime. You feel violated and angry, but when your own father and mother deliberately steal your social security number to open fraudulent premium credit cards, it is an entirely different level of evil. When they use your clean financial slate to fund their tropical vacations, their custom kitchen renovations, and their expensive country club dinners, while you cannot even afford to turn on the weak-rattling heater in your miserable apartment, it is a profound, soul-crushing betrayal. It completely destroys the very foundation of trust you are supposed to have in the people who brought you into this world. My parents used the sacred concept of family as a weapon against me. They used it as a heavy iron shield to hide their massive financial crimes. They smiled brightly at church functions and local community gatherings, collecting endless praise for being such supportive, successful parents, while they were literally holding my head underwater and watching me drown in student loan debt. They lectured me about independence and the absolute value of hard work while they were secretly committing federal tax fraud and severe elder abuse. I know there are people watching this video right now who have felt that exact same cold, heavy grip around their own necks. I know there are people out there who have spent decades making exhausting excuses for toxic parents, greedy siblings, or malicious relatives. Society puts a massive, heavy guilt trip on us. People who have never experienced this specific kind of calculated abuse will look at you with judgment and say, you have to forgive them. They will insist that setting strict boundaries is cruel or overly dramatic. They will accuse you of selfishly breaking up the family and ruining the holiday gatherings. But let me tell you the absolute, undeniable truth from someone who finally walked through the fire and came out on the other side. Boundaries are not a betrayal. Boundaries are the ultimate form of self-protection against those who aggressively exploit the family name. When you finally stand up, plant your feet firmly on the ground, and refuse to be a helpless victim anymore, you are not destroying a family. You are simply refusing to participate in a toxic, elaborate lie. You are refusing to be the designated, quiet scapegoat for people who completely refuse to take accountability for their own malicious actions. Cutting off toxic family members is not an act of bitter revenge. It is an act of pure survival. You are not required to set yourself on fire just to keep other people warm. You do not owe your absolute misery to anyone just because you happen to share the same bloodline or the same last name. When I sit on the bright yellow front porch of my new home with my grandmother Clara, I do not feel even a single ounce of regret. I look at the beautiful vegetable garden we planted together in the rich, dark soil, and I realize that true personal growth can only happen when you finally find the courage to pull the toxic weeds out by their very roots. My parents and my sister are currently living with the exact brutal consequences of their own infinite greed. They built a massive false empire on stolen money, fraudulent tax returns, and fake credit scores. They absolutely deserve to watch that fake empire collapse completely into dust. I did not ruin their perfect suburban lives. I simply stopped letting them ruin mine. It takes a massive, extraordinary amount of courage to walk away from the people who raised you. It takes incredible mental strength to sit alone in a quiet room and finally realize that the love you spent your entire life desperately begging for was never actually real. It is a terrifying, painful realization that can completely break your heart. But once you finally accept that hard truth, you suddenly become completely untouchable. You realize that you do not need their validation to exist. You do not need their permission to be happy, successful, or secure. You only need your own self-respect and the undeniable truth of your own experience. The healing process is not always perfectly smooth or easy. There are still days when the dark memory of my father's angry, flushed face screaming at me in my tiny kitchen makes my pulse race. There are still quiet moments when I remember my mother dragging me aggressively by the arm, threatening me to stay absolutely silent, and I feel that old familiar sting of maternal rejection. But those dark moments are completely fleeting now. They do not hold any real power over me, and they do not define my current reality. I successfully replaced their loud, toxic demands with the quiet, beautiful peace of a life built on absolute honesty and genuine love. For those of you who are 50 or 60 or even older watching this right now, please listen to me very carefully. It is absolutely never too late to take your own life back. It is never too late to look at a sibling who has financially abused you for decades, or a parent who has constantly belittled your achievements and finally say, enough is enough. You have the fundamental human right to spend the rest of your precious years surrounded by people who genuinely value you for exactly who you are, not for what they can secretly extract from your bank account, your labor, or your emotional energy. You have the right to lock the door and refuse to let the darkness back inside. You have the power to write a completely new ending to your own story just like I did. You can pay off the debts they saddled you with. You can buy the cozy house with the big windows. You can sit on your own front porch and drink warm tea completely free from the suffocating weight of their constant lies and their endless greedy expectations. Have you ever discovered a shocking secret your family has been hiding? Have you ever found out that the people who were supposed to protect you were actually the ones quietly tearing your life apart behind your back? What would you do in my situation? Would you have confronted them at the barbecue? Or would you have waited for the judge to hand down the final ruling? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and I know that sharing our painful truths helps completely shatter the isolation that toxic families rely on. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and let me know which state you are watching this video from and at what time. Your support helps these stories of justice spread further and reach the people who desperately need to hear that they are not alone and that they absolutely deserve to be free.